On August 31st, 1985, serial killer Richard Ramirez walked into a Los Angeles convenience store. At first, the man known as the Night Stalker looked like any normal person. But then he noticed his face on a newspaper cover and ran for his life. At that point, Richard Ramirez was already considered the prime suspect in the brutal Night Stalker crimes that had been terrorizing California for over a year. But authorities had only released his name and photo to the public. This gave residents plenty of time to memorize his physical features and point him out to authorities as he fled the store. It also gave Ramirez little chance of escape. But of course, he tried. The resulting manhunt involved 7 police cars and a helicopter that followed Ramirez around the city. But an angry mob of bystanders caught up to him first. Outraged by his heinous crimes, they began beating him relentlessly, and at least one man used a metal pole. By the time the police arrived, Ramirez was almost thanking them for his arrest. The Night Stalker had begun his brutal, murderous campaign nearly a year before his arrest. During that time, Richard Ramirez killed at least 14 people and committed countless acts of violence. But his criminal career began much earlier. Born on February 29, 1960, Richard Ramirez grew up in El Paso, Texas. Ramirez claimed that his father was physically abusive to him and that he suffered multiple head injuries at a young age. One injury was so severe that it caused him to have seizures. To escape his abusive father, Ramirez spent a lot of time with his older cousin Miguel, who had arrived from Vietnam. Unfortunately, Miguel's influences were not much better than his father's. During his time in Vietnam, Miguel raped and tortured several Vietnamese women, even cutting off parts of their bodies. Disgustingly, he had photographic evidence to prove it. He would show little Richie photos of the horror he inflicted on the women. When Ramirez was just 13 years old, he witnessed his cousin murder his wife. After the shooting, Ramirez began to transform from a frightened, abused boy into a hardened, depressed young man. From his interest in Satanism to his drug addiction, Ramirez's life took a dark turn. Worse, he was still under the influence of his cousin. Miguel was acquitted of murder by reason of insanity. Miguel eventually spent only 4 years in a psychiatric hospital before being released. It wasn't long before Ramirez developed an obsession with the physical and psychological violence Miguel had inflicted on the women in his photographs. Ramirez also began having more run-ins with the law, especially after moving to the Los Angeles area. While most of his early crimes in the late 1970s and early 1980s were related to robbery and drug possession, it was only a matter of time before they escalated into unspeakable violence. After his arrest, Richard Ramirez was openly bragging about his Satanism. For a long time, it was believed that Ramirez's first murder occurred on June 28, 1984. That was when he killed 79-year-old Jenny Vinco. Ramirez stabbed and sexually assaulted his victim and cut her throat so deeply that she nearly lost her head. But decades after Ramirez's arrest in 1985, he was also linked by genetic evidence to the murder of a 9-year-old girl, which occurred on April 10, 1984, several months after Vinco's murder. So that may have been his first murder, unless more happened before then. After Vinco's murder, it would be several months before Richard Ramirez killed again. But when he did, his depraved behavior was terrifying. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez attacked Maria Hernandez in her home. Although Hernandez managed to escape, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, was not so lucky. That evening, Okazaki became one of Ramirez's murder victims. But Ramirez wasn't done yet. That same night, he shot and killed another victim, Tsai Lian Yu. About a week later, Ramirez killed Vincent Zazara, 64, and his wife, Maxine, 44. Disgustingly, Ramirez then began establishing his signature attack pattern, shooting and killing the husband, then assaulting and stabbing the wife. Maxine's murder was different. He gouged out her eyes. At first, Ramirez seemed to only attack people near Los Angeles, but he soon claimed a number of victims near San Francisco as well. Since the press dubbed him the Night Stalker, it was clear that most of his crimes occurred at night, which added another scary element. Many of his attacks also included a satanic element. In some cases, Ramirez would carve reversed stars into his victims' bodies. In others, he would force his victims to swear their love for Satan. Throughout California, people feared that the Night Stalker would break into their homes while they slept, and perform untold rituals of rape, torture, and murder. Since he seemed to attack at random, it seemed that no one was safe. The LAPD increased its presence on the streets and even created a special task force just to find him, with help from the FBI. At the same time, public anxiety was so intense that there was a marked increase in the sale of guns, locksmiths, burglar alarms, and attack dogs. But ultimately, it was Richard Ramirez's own mistakes in August 1985 that led to his arrest. After seeing a witness to the crime outside his home, he accidentally left a fingerprint and also left his car and license plate in plain sight. When police found the vehicle, they were able to find enough fingerprints to make a match. By then, they had already received tips that someone with the Ramirez last name was involved. Sure enough, the LAPD was able to identify Richard Ramirez thanks to their new fingerprint database. Although the records only included criminals born after January 1960, it turned out that Ramirez was born in February 1960. Authorities soon found photos of Ramirez from his previous arrests, and one of his victim's survivors came up with a detailed description that was almost exactly like the photos. By the end of August 1985, police decided to release the photo and name of the Night Stalker. Although they initially worried that this would give Ramirez a chance to escape, it turned out he was completely oblivious to his newfound fame, until it was too late. By pure coincidence, Richard Ramirez was on a flight back to Los Angeles when his photo was published. He didn't realize he was being tracked until he got back to town and saw his face in the newspapers. Despite trying to evade police and trying to steal a car in the process, he was followed by a swarm of vigilantes who recognized him in part because of Ramirez's bad teeth. They attacked him, and the police surrounded him. After his arrest, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders. In addition to the murder charges, authorities also found him responsible for several rapes, assaults, and robberies. Ramirez was sentenced to death in the gas chamber for his crimes, and smiled in response. "I'm beyond good and evil," he later said. "I'm going to get my revenge. Lucifer lives in all of us, that's all." "Hey, no problem," he said, shortly after receiving his death sentence. "Death is always there. I'll see you at Disneyland." He remained incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison for the rest of his life, but he was never returned to the death row. Because of the complex nature of his case, which included a 50,000-page trial record, the state Supreme Court was unable to hear his appeal until 2006. Although the court dismissed his claims, additional appeals were expected to take several more years. During this long delay, Richard Ramirez met a female admirer named Doreen Leoy, who began a correspondence with him. In 1996, he married her while on death row. Most people clearly did not share her sentiments. To many Californians who lived in terror during the mid-1980s, Ramirez was little different from the devil they worshipped. "He's just evil. He's pure evil," Peter Zazzara, son of victim Vincent Zazzara, said in 2006. "I don't know why anyone would want to do something like that, to enjoy the way it happened."